Welcome to everyone who's joining us, and thank you to 1623 Studios for posting the meeting. And we are coming out of an executive session and just starting our regular business meeting now. We will begin with public comment. I just want to take a moment to remind everybody that this is an opportunity for comment, not debate. I'm actually just going to look and see if anybody is planning to make a comment. If you could put your name in the chat. Is there anybody on the phone who's planning to make a comment? Okay, then seeing that we have nobody planning to make a public comment, I think I can waive my long speech about public comments and just go on with the rest of the meeting. And so we would really like to start our meeting with our student report. And I see that Theo, who is the senior on our new student council for the school committee, is here. So Theo, would you like to make a report?
Sure.
Yay.
Okay, so I mean, you guys are probably more familiar with this than I am, but I'm just here to kind of represent the opinions voiced during the meeting we had earlier with several students. And we mainly discussed the general feelings that students were having re-entering the school year, and especially considering the academic rigor of returning into in-person school as opposed to virtual schooling. So generally, the consensus was there was a pretty smooth transition. There is a general feeling that there was work to be caught up on as a result of online learning. It was the learning process was a lot slower. We covered less material. That's generally an opinion shared across the students. But so far, the transition's been pretty successful. Some students were having issues with, or worries rather, with missing school and getting behind. Again, with the new level of the academics that we were covering at the school. Some students were worried that if they missed a school day because they were sick or something, they would be caught behind and wouldn't be able to catch up. And the solution that we generally discussed the most was communication amongst students and teachers. And the school, we feel, needs to make it as clear as possible and really encourage students to be able to communicate with students. And I can say, especially in my personal experience, I haven't been overly anxious about missing school or getting caught behind in school because I have been able to communicate with my teachers. They've generally been incredibly responsive. If I send an email or a heads up, whether it's because I'm missing school or I'm concerned about my understanding with certain courses or subsections of the units we're covering, they're generally very good at making sure I'm caught up, and they're very flexible and accommodating. So, but that is a solution that, especially underclassmen who tend to be a little bit more meek when it comes to interacting with teachers, tend to shy away from a bit. So the school, we feel, needs to encourage communication as much as possible, especially at a time like this.
All right, is that all you wanted to share, Theo? I mean, that was awesome.
Yeah, that's all we have. All right, all I have.
Thank you so much, Theo. It was so great for me to get to go in and meet with this great group of high schoolers. And so we're really looking forward to your reports and hearing what you've got going on around the school. If it's okay with you, we usually let school committee members ask you questions if they have any. So is that okay?
Of course. Mm-hmm.
All right. Is there anybody on the school committee who has a question for Theo?
I actually do. I have a question. Theo, my name is Teresa Whitman. Nice to meet you. My question to you is actually about the concern that you said that students are feeling about falling behind now that we're back full time and having a little bit more in-depth studies. Would you say it's more than it would have been pre-COVID, or And the reason I ask is I'm noticing this in my family too, where last year you weren't really that worried about it because you could just do everything from home anyway. So is that something that you'd say is more than pre-COVID, or do you think this is like a bounce back response kind of thing?
I think it's slightly more than pre-COVID, and this is probably just a combination of we just like you said, we kind of adjusted to being online, and there's a certain casualness that comes with online learning that you have to adjust to.
Yeah.
And some students have been slower to that than others, and then also online learning has put us a little bit more behind. So the workload's a bit bigger.
Okay, got it. Thanks for sharing. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Theo. Thanks so much for sharing and for volunteering to serve on that group. And we're just really excited to have a whole group of students on our student advisory board. So thank you. All right. Anybody else have questions for Theo? All right. Then we will move on. I have a short chair's report. So it is the last week of school before Thanksgiving, and I think things are going remarkably well at school. Our sports teams are excelling. You can come see the football team on Thanksgiving morning. The high school first quarter ended and report cards went out. Elementary schools just had their conferences. So hopefully between the conferences and the open houses, everybody's had a chance to check in with their children's teachers and see the classrooms firsthand, which is always a fun part of the school year. Unfortunately, in recent days, we have heard about an uptick in COVID cases in the community and some students who are having to quarantine due to close contacts outside of school. And I totally understand that this is very stressful for students and their families. So I just want to remind everybody to continue to take precautions, such as wearing a mask and maintaining social distance, even when you're outside of school, especially as we roll into the holidays, so that we can do our best to keep everybody in school as much as possible and safe and healthy. So thanks again, everybody, for joining us tonight and for continuing to participate in conversations with your school committee in a kind and respectful manner. I have to say, we do occasionally, we're still getting some letters, but people, the tone has been very positive and people are respectful. And even when we have differences of opinion, I think that's really important that we're able to keep the lines of communication open. So thank you, everybody. And now we can move on to the consent agenda, which includes vouchers 1016, which was for the Manchester Memorial Building, some items, and 1017, which included some technology licenses, repairs to the divider for the middle school, high school gym, and some athletics spending. And some of that athletics comes out of the revolving fund, which is offset by user fees. So I just wanted to point that out. So do I have, I don't believe there were any new minutes. Okay, so no new minutes. Okay, so do I have a motion to approve the consent agenda with vouchers 1016 and 1017?
So moved, Whitman.
Second, Kate.
Okay, is there any discussion? All right, we need to approve by roll call. So Eric?
Yes.
Matt?
Yes.
Kate?
Yes.
Chris?
Yes.
Teresa?
Yes.
And I'm a yes as well. So the consent agenda passes unanimously. All right, over to you, Pam. No, for subcommittee reports. We have subcommittee reports. I wasn't looking at my agenda. Is there a facilities report?
There was a facilities meeting that we were invited to, but it was the same week as another, the last time we met. And so I wasn't able to make it. Chris, were you able to make it to that meeting?
No, I wasn't.
Okay. So we
Pam or Avi, do you want to update us on any facilities?
Sure, I'll give you the big picture. The meeting is really, it was a very productive meeting. It was a long meeting. A lot of little things come up at the end of the project that just need to be resolved, tied off, and decisions made. So we just spent a lot of time discussing those issues. Avi, I don't know if there any that are notable for this group that are out of the norm. Other than that, it's you know, on time, on budget remains the mantra, even though there will be a few items that have to hang over till spring, just because we missed planting season, or we need to watch a particular drainage area to make sure the system in place is actually viable and works, and may need some additional follow-up in the spring. Avi, you follow this with a fine tooth, you follow the details on the day-to-day. Is there anything worth noting tonight?
I mean, I think your summary was spot on. I think there are a couple of things that could go into the spring because everyone feels like it's a good approach to do, rather than being, in a situation of why is this happening? So we could certainly speed certain things along. There's certain things that we just felt like, as Pam said, maybe with the drainage issue, or as an example, where people feel like it's prudent to just take the time because we are under budget and we have the ability to do that. It wouldn't impact budget. So we have that flexibility. Whereas in a traditional project, every day is a financial situation. So we're doing really well, and it's great to see issues getting solved collaboratively. Big news, soon we're almost ready to have the loop opened up. When the time comes, the principal will be sending out a notice to families explaining how that's going to work logistically. But that, is in essence the biggest part of phase 3, which is opening up the driveway loop. And if you've been by there, you can see it's largely in good shape. There's still some plantings that have to happen, most of which will happen now. Some might go into the spring. So it's really moving along, and we're really getting to the finish line.
Based on the conversation today, I think they're trying to open up the loop on Friday, but that's just a tentative date at this point. So
While
it's in great shape.
While we're in this, though, and doesn't have to be answered right now, but it might be helpful for Chris and I to have a connection with you guys at some point to see what we should be anticipating moving forward, if we're going to need to meet before we do the next, the evaluation for EES and the middle high school, or what you need from us in this.
Thank you for bringing that up, because we did discuss at the meeting, I think it was 2 Thursdays ago now, the SBC meeting, to get a date on the books sometime in early December to do a tour of EES with the building committee, to just take a look at what the state of affairs is there. Avi's working on commissioning the second version of the Habib report, so a facilities report on Essex in the middle high school, which will serve as a guide for our timelining when we think we need to bring the project forward to MSBA. And the facilities committee will need to start to take up the planning for field replacement, and whether to do 1 or 2 at a time to try to get a discount, and work through with the towns what the financing structure may be for replacement of Brook Street School. So there's detail work to doing some cleanup on Memorial School, and I mean cleanup in terms of kind of paperwork and technical items with closeout of the MSBA and teams moving off site. That's pretty process oriented, and I think pretty direct and to the point. The newer projects are going to be really the main agenda items for the incoming committee to deal with, and they're exciting.
Awesome. Is there a finance committee report? I don't think that the collaborative group met again since our last meeting, or am I crazy? I mean, we met at the Essex FinCom meeting.
Yeah, and that could fit right into the bulk of our agenda, which is kind of a discussion about what happened at the Essex FinCom meeting, and a share out of the slide as a prep up for our upcoming budget season.
Yeah, we can cover that in the budget workshop, right? Okay. Did policy committee have anything this week?
No policy issues have arisen.
Okay. And negotiations, we're still working on developing our timeline with the union representation to start working on our new contract. And we continue to keep all those lines of communication open, because we love our teachers and we love working with our META reps. And now over to Pam for the superintendent's report.
course, I want the superintendent's report and I'm going to get the budget. So give me 1 second. Let's close something up. Okay, so just a few general district updates and announcements. We've had a great fall athletic season. Sarah, you mentioned that in your report as well. We had several teams going into the playoffs as of today. Well, it's right now. The girls are getting ready to start the semifinal round for the D4 state championship. So if they're successful tonight, they'll be moving forward to a game to be announced later this week. So cheers to our field hockey players. And cross country made it to the divisional state championships with some of our students qualifying and heading into continued competition this weekend. So we do have the one more football game on Thanksgiving, which is more tradition than it is competitive. We're always competitive with Georgetown, but this is a non-division game that's played outside the typical schedule. But our fall athletics has just been a lot of fun with a lot of spirit and a lot of great attendance at all of the games. So, you know, tip of the cap to all of our athletes and their efforts this fall. We have the NEAS visit underway at the high school. It's wrapping up in the next day or two. What they do is, this is a multi-year process for folks who have been on the committee for some time. We began this back in 18 with self-study in the initial visit, and this is a follow-up to that process. So they actually were commenting, we were in a session with them today, that they were able to see us pre-COVID and post-COVID, and they're able to see how we weathered that storm, and they were actually quite complimentary for all of the work that not only the high school but the entire district has done to stay on track and moving forward during COVID, acknowledging that we had to put a few things aside just because we weren't all together and able to work on multiple projects at one time last year, but they were very impressed that we were able to maintain the development of the vision of the graduate in the strategic planning efforts and came out of it with a very much a focus on the future. So I think the visit's going really well. There'll be a report that they generate out of that that will assist Tricia and her team in future planning. The memorial ribbon cutting ceremony, so this does go back to the facilities report. I think I had sent you a note saying December 8th was going to be our day. MSBA has notified us they cannot participate. So it's going to be in that early December window. We're just looking for a date where we can have all of the dignitaries available. So stay tuned for that. As soon as we lock everyone in, we'll get an announcement out for people to attend. Quick update on our DEI work, which is one of our core values and key strategic initiatives. We continue our leadership training with Michael Eatman. Again, he's building our capacity for developing communities that are culturally proficient and able to pursue our goals of developing anti-racist policy and a more inclusive community. He's working with us to plan for the all-district January PD Day, and that Angela Bick is doing that in consultation with Michael Eatman and our professional development committee, which is made up of teachers. So they're working on the format for that. SEL work continues, and again, want to reinforce, it continues to be reinforced to us that our early work with Ruler and our emphasis on social emotional learning has provided a really strong foundation for our diversity, equity, and inclusion work that we're taking on now and moving forward district-wide. I wanted to note that we have heard from the Ruler team, the Mark Brackett group out of Yale, and MERSD will be featured as part of a research study that's being published. As soon as the chapter is available, I will be sharing it with everyone, but we have been a site that's providing them ongoing information, opportunity for observation, and they've conducted several focus groups on how SEL integrates into the classroom, how it supports special education students, and our partnership continues. I think they'll be on site this year to continue their research. So just really excited for all of our faculty that's participated in that and the good work that they've done. to develop the rule of program in their classrooms. It was delayed, but we'll be beginning the Teacher Diverse Education Statewide PLC on Thursday morning. This is the group that's going to examine means and methods for attracting and retaining a more diverse workforce. I know this is something that's been talked about as a goal for us for some time. I know it's a goal other communities have as well, and it's also an area that I think we all struggle with. So we're hoping to learn from each other how we can better pursue diversification of the workforce. And then under the equity goal and kind of a follow-up to our assessment reports, Angela Bick, the interim director of curriculum, is leading the effort to review our tiered systems of support and current RTI structures at the 2 elementary schools, with the hopes of coming up with a set of recommendations for efficient use of resources and commonality of structures between the 2 schools. So I think a natural next step after literacy and looking at the data post-COVID is, are we using our resources and do we have systems and structures that best support students and support them in an equitable manner? Kate, I think you raised that question last time. So we've got the team working on that, and I'm looking forward to some recommendations in the second half of the year. Moving on to a COVID update. Looking at our neighbors in the region and talking to some other school districts, our numbers still remain very low. I know our friends in Georgetown have had some spikes recently, and I agree with the comment that was made by Sarah earlier that in general numbers seem to be going up. Ours don't seem to be having an immediate. We have a small uptick, but nothing out of the ordinary. I'll show you our numbers shortly. Just to kind of recap, we're doing our weekly reporting. So you can always go to the website, click the link, and see where we are with student and staff cases. There will be no email communication going out as cases present themselves. They'll be logged in the Excel sheet. But if we get small outbreaks, a class or a sports team or a club team or activity, we will send a communication out. Testing program is available, but I think we're all learning together that test and stay is available for a very narrow window of people. You basically have to be a close contact, identified to be a close contact at school, so the transmission or potential transmission had to occur here, and you need to be unvaccinated. So given our vaccination status at the secondary level and the fact that we're adhering to all of the guidelines at the elementary, we have had no in-school transmission to this point. And I cannot, looking at my list, I don't see any in-school close contacts identified. Every close contact we've had to date has been generated externally. We know that the mask mandate's being extended to the 50s, and we're going to have a bit of a conversation on close contacts and quarantines in just a second, because I know there's some questions being raised about how we're supporting students in quarantine. And we had announced at the beginning of the year that we would manage those students like we would any other extended absence, which I know has raised questions about what our attendance looks like. So before we get into the discussion about how people are seeing this, what questions they might have, what wants they may have, let me just give you a quick rundown of the numbers. So year to date, we have 12 students positive and 5 staff members. That's since the first week of school. This month alone, we've had 3 and 3, so 3 students and 3 staff. So our numbers this month are still less than September, but we have outpaced October at this point. But still fairly manageable and no in-school transmission to date. And then I did have the question, Kate, I think you raised it. What does our attendance look like? And this may be a good segue into our conversation about how to manage close contacts and quarantine. So what we know is our positive rate is very low. We have no identified in-school close contacts. So anyone coming up as a close contact is being identified by DPH by activity on the outside of school. And our attendance numbers are really quite strong. They are up slightly from 2019, our last normal fall year, normal in the sense that we were in school on a regular basis. So we do see an uptick in the number of absences, But the percentage of absences with relation to the school student body is still quite low, and all schools have a 95% or better attendance rate. So what we're seeing is there may be some cases of extended absence. I think we're looking at between 8 and 10 quarantines since the beginning of the year in each building. It really hasn't impacted the overall attendance numbers. So circling back to the question, do we need to be doing something drastically different around close contacts and quarantines? At this point, I'm not seeing a need to change the process. What we're doing is outfitting students who need to be at home for an extended period of time, as we would if they decided to travel or fell ill at any other normal year, where teachers put together a package of learning. They can either pick it up on a daily or weekly basis, depending on the school and the teacher. And then there's some level of check-in, homework correction over the 2 weeks. So it's somewhat customized to each classroom and each level, because it plays out differently at the secondary than it does at the elementary. So very open to inputs and feedback and suggestions on this. And that's my jumping off point. Sarah.
I have an input on that.
Yep.
Which is just that I looked through the handbook and everything because I was trying to figure out if we have written down anywhere like what the expectation should be if your child is out for a long period of time, like from pre-COVID days. And I don't think we have anything in there. And the like rumblings that I'm hearing on the street, which are very quiet, it's not a lot of people, are just that there's sort of a lack of consistency, that like even at, like between two kids in one school, like a fourth grader might get something drastically different than what a second grader is getting, or like somebody at one of the elementary schools in fifth grade might get a whole packet of work, and then somebody at the other elementary school gets, very little work. And so I was just wondering if there's any way we could just, is there a mechanism for touching base to make sure that the expectations are clear and consistent?
There hasn't been to this point, because it's always been up to the classroom teacher to manage the student's absence.
Mm-hmm.
I have to agree with Sarah. I think that
Yep.
leaving it up to the discretion of the teacher leaves a lot of wiggle room. And that students who even are at the same grade level in the same position might be receiving drastically different supports. And moving forward, obviously none of our elementary students are able to be fully vaccinated right now, and they all live at home with families who are working and parents who are required to go to work. And so even though we're not having students with close contacts at school, I don't think that, we can necessarily say that students are being exposed because they're going to busy events or because they're going out to restaurants. And, I think that there is a fair amount of contact happening just through parents and families who are going about their daily lives and, making hard decisions about childcare and working. I think it's important that we standardize what kind of support our students are receiving, and sort of look at the guidance around, what the Department of Ed is saying they should be getting. And then even sort of bolstering ourselves against the possibility with like, all right, how many absences constitute homebound instruction, and what are we doing to ensure that all of a sudden, if we've had students who are on their second quarantine, that they're not then asking for a full, a homebound instruction situation.
Yep. So what I can tell you is that homebound instruction is a legal definition, and it requires the student to be unable to leave the home, so confined to the home. So the quarantine, to my knowledge, does not meet the definition of confined to the home. They're not medically confined to the home. It's not stemming from a medical issue. It's a preventative measure.
So are we saying students who are,
I'm saying that a homebound definition under homeschool policy is different than a quarantine issue.
Okay. I was thinking that homebound instruction was students who are medically required to be absent for 14 days or more.
It's not medically required to be absent. It's medically confined to the bed or home. Like they physically can't leave. The
I
quarantine-
feel like this is the kind of like
but that doesn't,
technicality that we don't want to be getting into, that we,
It's-
you know, we're in a small district.
the technicality only comes from using the homebound definition, which has a legal definition. If we're talking about how to service quarantine students, that's a totally just a different conversation.
No, I'm
So-
just saying I want us to be bolstered so that we're not in a position where we have families coming to us saying, hey, my kid's been required to be out of school for 4 weeks now. I want a teacher.
All right. Well, I think what we really need to look at, like the thing that we can manage perhaps, is to just tighten up a little bit, if it's possible, on letting, on what the expectations are. And I think what you described is perfect, like teachers giving packets of work and touching base and checking in. As everything you described sounds great. I think maybe it seems like it's not happening consistently in people's experiences. So maybe, I mean, we might have teachers who don't know that there's an expectation that they're going to send some things home.
Well, in
Or-
defense of, I'm going to defend the teachers. I think they do know, and they will make their best effort. I'm happy to talk with principals about communicating more clearly what the expectations are. I think I want to get some better sense from this group on whether or not you're starting to think about wanting to invoke remote learning when students are out.
I
Just
don't want to
wondering,
invoke in
like,
remote learning.
no,
And I talked
absolutely
about
not.
that student group, this high schoolers certainly had no interest at all in any kind of remote learning situation.
I think that what I'm wondering is, so on asynchronous learning days last year, my kids just had a menu. It was usually like a PDF document with clickable links of learning resources that they could access. I'm wondering if we can have those available in a file and that teachers can just send them out. And those, you know, those are resources that have already been developed. And so I guess I want to see us leveraging those as much as possible.
My thought on this to share is that I agree that we should do something to recognize that quarantine is different from just an extended absence. And so, you know, just expecting teachers to handle it at the classroom level doesn't have any level of consistency that would happen if, for instance, I was taking my kids on vacation for 6 school days. I wouldn't necessarily expect that they're going to be front loaded with their work for that. But this is a specific circumstance and a particular thing that we've been in for quite some time now. So it does seem like we could have some form of consistency, at least within the different levels, you know, certainly within the elementary level. At the
Is this
school
playing
level.
out particularly at the elementary level? Because I'm hearing elementary references.
I think
The only complaints I've heard have been from the elementary level. And I think that's probably because in the middle school and the high school, teachers are consistently using Google Classroom. Kids are more able to check in with their friends and their teachers remotely. They've got work to do. I think that,
Well, and Sarah, I think it's important to add also that those students are eligible to be vaccinated. So
Yeah,
their
also.
close contact is, if they're vaccinated, they're not having to quarantine.
or if they are, it's for shorter and all of those things. So, but at the elementary school, I think we need to recognize that the teachers are working really hard, and they're very stressed out. And I don't want to be putting more on the teacher's plate. And so I don't want teachers to listen to this and get all stressed out and think that we just want them to be doing a lot more. I do wonder if, like Kate had the point about the menus that were available last year. I know that our new reading curriculum has an online component. I know that we have online math. I do think that maybe, and I don't want to micromanage this because sometimes I put my teacher hat on and I want to like come up with all the ideas for how to solve the problem. I do think we've got a lot of creative teachers and administrators, and they could work together and maybe come up with a pretty simple solution that would satisfy everybody's needs.
Can I just say too, when I say something consistent, I don't necessarily mean that it has to be anything. If the decision is at the elementary level, you are absent and you are sick, that's the answer, but it's a consistent answer. That's what I'm saying.
I hear you. We will go to work on that.
Thank
And
you.
then the other thing that I would add is that I think it would be really simple and really strategic and supportive of us to have a letter district-wide that's drafted and ready to go out to any family that has kids quarantined at home, sort of outlining the expectations, both medically in terms of, are we still supposed to be filling out MedBot? What is the responsibility to report symptoms to the nurse? Sort of outlining that information, and then outlining what the expectations are in terms of catching up on work when they get back, staying in communication with the school, sort of all of those like nitty-gritty details, but also that really sends a message that, we're part of a community and we're supporting you through this, and you're not, we recognize that quarantining students at home is really a way to support the community as a whole, and that these students are at home in order to, for this greater good, and we're all in this together still, just like we were last year. I feel like that's what's sort of different this year, is that last year there was a sense that we were all sort of in this limbo, and that lots of kids were coming and going and teachers were coming and going, and this was a necessity for the greater good. And I feel like we've sort of lost track of that, and I want to make sure that families are still aware that we're a community and we're all working together to support each other through this.
Hey, that was really beautifully said.
Thanks, Sarah.
Also, wait, there was one other thing I wanted to say, which was on the tip of my tongue, and now maybe I lost it. I think.
I
Go ahead.
do have a follow-up question.
Yeah.
So out of the initial, I think at this point we have 170 plus elementary students who have received their vaccination first round. We have another event coming up on Saturday. At what point, thinking about the longer term plan, does it become more of a home responsibility than a school responsibility to manage the quarantine? Are we looking, once we are past a certain level of eligibility for the elementary students to receive their vaccination? Because I can see this problem persisting for quite some time based on everybody's right to personal choice. So at some point, it's going to become personal choice versus the common good, and what we can control at school. So I think we should try to think on timeline too.
I think it's wise to have a contingency plan in place. I mean, I think that what we're seeing right now, even with vaccinated adults, is that these breakthrough cases are starting. And I'm concerned that with the timeline of when our middle school and high school students were vaccinated, that those breakthrough cases could happen. I'm not saying that, who knows, but I think that we should be prepared for the fact that those could start happening in the winter.
So that's why I'm going to keep pushing you guys. You
Right.
want me to develop a plan for remote learning?
I don't
know
that
I'm hearing
like
that we need to leverage our asynchronous and remote abilities to prepare a contingency plan. It will take some time. That's why I'm trying to gain some clarity here.
I just think we need to have a standardized packet of whatever that we send to the students who are home, and particularly in elementary, maybe by grade level. So I don't think that's the same as establishing a remote learning plan. I just think, and honestly, I think I hear what you're saying with the vaccine rates and the younger children. I think when we wrote our new strategic plan, we really talked about putting the child's experience at the forefront. And I think we need to do whatever we can to make the child's experience the best. Kids in elementary school aren't making the decision whether or not they get to be, their families are deciding to vaccinate them or not. And so if they are having to quarantine longer because they're unvaccinated in May or whatever, I think it's still our responsibility to make sure they get a packet of work to do while they're at home.
Okay.
Not to provide a whole remote learning experience.
I think if we're looking like back to the phases of COVID, my thinking, and I can't speak for anyone else, is that this is back to like after the initial shutdown when we're not introducing any new material, we're not providing any instruction, we're just providing some connection and some skill practice.
Okay.
Can I just share that as far as a timeline, to me, this one's kind of a no-brainer. Let's connect this with the mask mandate. As long as our buildings, our kids are having to all universally mask, that's kind of the deadline for when it becomes a more home-focused concern, is after we reach whatever that determination ends up being for not having a universal mask mandate.
True. It also wouldn't help. It wouldn't hurt for whatever like system we put together to be the packet moving forward when we're not in COVID. But anytime somebody's sick well, I don't know. I guess it's different because they're usually sick and then they need their stuff after they come back to catch up.
So what I think I'm hearing from the discussion at the staff level is that typically the work that goes home is an accumulation of the work that is done in the week that the student misses, so they stay on track with what's going on in the classroom. But there's live instruction in the classroom that we're not going to replicate online. So what we're going to need to do, if I'm hearing this conversation, is the request is really to establish a separate asynchronous platform which students can access in their absence so that there's a place to do work, because otherwise it's going to be a more traditional, this is what we're working on this week, and now it's going home with you.
I don't even know, Pam, how closely, just thinking of, and I don't want to speak for anybody else, but just thinking of my own experiences and what I would have liked for my kids to be doing is really just like, it could even be evergreen material, it could just be like, this is great, appropriate practice work that is keeping us feeling like we're in a school routine and keeping us feeling like we're connected to the classroom, but isn't even necessarily exactly what is going on in the classroom. Just speaking from a more practical standpoint of trying to make this easy on everybody. Anyway, yeah.
Like a math review packet and some journaling, writing, like a week's worth of journal prompts and a link to the reading program and a link to the math facts practice online.
And even just having that come from the school rather than having it come from the parent sends a totally different message to the kids who are at home.
And I don't even think it has to be a ton from the teacher. I mean, you're expected to read 25 minutes, twice a day and log your writing. That is entirely done on my terms. You know what I mean? And then I'm presenting it to the teacher down the line.
Yeah. Again, I think that the teachers on the committee are getting into wanting to figure out the nitty-gritty details of this. No, I don't know.
I'm actually not. I'm just trying to
easiest for me as a teacher, and it would really be to put evergreen materials into a drive that was easily accessible.
And I think the reason that we're getting into the ideas is because I personally want to make sure that what you're hearing is what we're actually, is because there seems like, I'm not trying to say that there should be a remote learning plan underlying. I'm not trying to say there should be much that teachers have to do. I'm just saying there should be something consistent. And I agree with Kate that community building aspect should be there.
And I wonder if this is a totally different extension, but I wonder if also the opportunity for this asynchronous work can be extended to weather days over the winter. I know that when we were in remote learning last winter, we had the first snow day and then were able to just do asynchronous or remote learning on other weather days. And I wonder if having these resources available could potentially open up the doors to do asynchronous learning rather than snow days on weather days. I can see Teresa making a face behind her hand. Sorry.
I'll
So I
fight you
think
for
there's-
snow days.
I think there's a couple of things, and I do like consistency, and I do like having a protocol, but I think for putting snow days aside, there's mixed feelings up, down, and all around on how those should play out. And there's everything from electricity to consider to where the people, so there's a whole bunch of stuff that goes along with the weather days and what may or may not make things feasible.
I
Then
thought
there's-
of what
Go ahead.
I thought of what I wanted to say before, and I think it's kind of it's really important in my head. I don't know that it's really important in the world. But my thought is we want to make sure that we're not discouraging from people to quarantine when they're supposed to be quarantining. So it's one thing if you get an actual close contact from the Board of Health and you get your PCR test and it's positive, you know for sure you have to quarantine. But like a lot of people are now taking the tests at home. So if somebody takes a test at home and like, so mom takes a test at home, she knows she's positive. She knows that her kid's really supposed to quarantine now for 14 days because they're a close contact, but nobody else really knows that. So maybe people would make decisions that are not in the best interest of the health of the whole community if they have a disincentive to actually fulfill their whole quarantine. So we just want to make sure that we're doing everything we can to support the people in all of the positions.
We certainly want to support people, but I think what we know is that it's different for every classroom, for every student, and for every home situation on what the true need is. And that we don't have the authority necessarily to ask for any validation on whether it's a positive or negative test. So there's a whole bunch.
No.
There's a whole lot of stuff that goes into what is the absence, why is there an absence, and what is in the best interest of students. So I think what I'm hearing is you want to make sure that teachers have work available for students. I don't want to really belabor this because we have quite a bit to go through on the budget. I'm still a bit confused on whether or not there needs to be, whether the request is for us to investigate a technology component for the absence or not. Because I'm hearing a lot about asynchronous, the platform, links, and going online. So that is asking teachers to now develop a separate set of at-home lessons that correspond to where they are in the learning process for it to have value. And I just want to make sure what I'm asking people to investigate and give me feedback on internally syncs with what you're hearing some of the wants on are. And to be honest, if we're looking at 9 to 10 people per school to this point, it seems to have been working up to this point. So is the concern that we're just going to have more kids and more volume, or that we're not hearing directly that it's from those it's not working for? Because my understanding is that teachers and principals have been working with the parents who have been under quarantine since the beginning of the year with an okay level of success.
Well, maybe you could just check back in with the principals and just confirm that for sure.
Okay.
Or with
Do a little
families maybe who've
investigation.
been quarantined. And even if we're talking about, 9 to 10 students, that's how many school days is that? I'm looking at the numbers from Essex Elementary, and it was, 2019, 290 absences, 2021, 411.
Right, of a potential 11,000 absences.
So could we take this instead of it being an ask on our part of to put forth a thing? Could we just leave it or just offer it to you, Pam, as maybe that's on schools to do, talk to the administrators and see what would be a reasonable thing. Can you please come up with a consistent something, whether it's a consistent nothing or a consistent this or a consistent this, whatever you guys feel is manageable.
Yeah.
And let us know what it's going to be.
Yep. And the consistent report back has been that we are asking teachers to prepare packets and make contact with the families for those who have been out. I will clarify it. I will speak with them and I will report back to you at the next session.
Thank you.
Well,
All right. Are we ready to move on?
are we ready for budget?
Yes, thank you.
All right. I'm going to switch out the slides. All right, so we thought we tabled the discussion for the finance subcommittee to carry over to this part of the agenda. So maybe it's best that we start now with a recap of the Essex FinCom meeting, Essex Joint FinCom Board of Selectmen meeting, just kind of top level, what happened, how it went, and then we can take you through the budget basics in preparation for what really becomes the bulk of our work over the next 2 months, the budget development process. Before I do that, Sarah, was Cheryl on the line for a CPAC update? Or...
No, Cheryl did not have a report tonight. She did let me know that earlier today.
Okay. So let's start with a recap from our meeting last week from our FinCom, our subcommittee members.
Well, that was me. So.
And Sarah and Ken was there too.
Oh yeah, okay. I thought you were asking for the subcommittee.
But you can go.
Sarah,
for
you
it.
want to go for it? Sarah's off camera. Okay. I thought that was a really exceptionally well planned, presented, and prepared, just all around and received presentation. The conversations that I've had since have reflected that, certainly. I think that it was a great opportunity for those two boards in particular to really ask the questions they needed to ask. And it also gave us a sense of what those questions still are, or what has changed and what hasn't. And so that's my recap of it, is just that it was a really it was long and appropriately so, and a really generous use of time by everybody involved, because a lot of those questions, just from any person sitting there, that needed to ask whatever it was, little things, were able to get it out all on the table, and also even bring it into a forward-looking outlook, which I just really appreciated. Sarah, you're on mute.
Thank you so much to Pam and Avi for putting together an amazing presentation, and to everybody who came. And I agree. And there was also a great little follow-up story on Cape Ann News, if anybody had a chance to catch that. But yeah, all in all, a great presentation. I know a lot of the slides are going to be included in the presentation tonight, so everybody who's on the call gets a chance to see those.
Great. So let's kick off by looking just a quick look ahead on what our budget calendar looks like. So this has been in the last couple of packets. I don't know if anybody's really spent any time with it, but tonight is usually our initial discussion. So what we'll do is we'll give you an abbreviated version of the Essex presentation, but it really does capture kind of the top level history and drivers of our budget, which will end up being the general headers for points of finer discussion down the line. And that will make more sense to you once we go through it. So tonight we're going to kind of talk about big picture basics and where we foresee some of this going in the coming months. On December 2nd, we're going to present you with the tentative budget. So by regional agreement, we are to have a tentative budget approved by the school committee and shared with the towns by the second Wednesday in December, and hold a hearing for public input. So the public hearing on the 15th is different than public comment. So public comment is an opportunity for someone to come to the meeting and share a thought, but isn't necessarily the subject of our meeting. The public hearing is intentionally a presentation of the budget and then an open session for which people can give us feedback and guidance and ideas for the committee to consider in further formulation and decision making around the budget. So we'll present the tentative on the 2nd to the school committee, then present it to the general public on the 15th for feedback. Then we go dormant for a little bit, but it doesn't feel like a long period of time because we have the holiday break in there traditionally, so there isn't much movement in the assumptions or revisions to the budget, and we'll come back on the 11th and do a discussion about where we are based on things that may have changed in some of our predictions. And then by the 25th, we're holding a second hearing. So the 11th is a chance to revise On January 25th, our revisions go back out for public hearing. Again, a session at which general public can give us feedback and direction on what they'd like to see done differently or recommendations on the budget, ask questions and get responses. Then we will come back on Tuesday, February 1st and present the budget to the committee for formal adoption. So this is our resolution of all of our debates and deliberations over the past 2 months, coming to conclusion and being ready to be packaged up and delivered to the 2 towns so they can start to prepare for town meeting, because our budget ultimately ends up on the town meeting warrant. Throughout this process, in parallel, we'll be working with the town collaboration group, which is the representatives from the boards of selectmen and FinCom in each town, to make sure we're all on the same page with anticipating any surprises or economic shifts, so that no one is caught short at the end or surprised with what the outcome numbers will be. And what those numbers will be will make a little more sense to you after we go through the presentation. In March, we go through the official process of certifying the apportionment. That's how we split the bill between the 2 towns. And then we go through the town meetings. By the time we get to town meeting, it's not typically dramatic. We've had ongoing discussions with the boards. They make a recommendation. Until last year, those have always been favorable recommendations with explanations as to why. And then from there, we have a formal budget. Not on this sheet, but typically part of our work is in the month of March, if we submit a budget that has an unidentified reduction in it, so on February 1st, if you vote a budget that comes out to a certain number to fit within our framework, but we haven't made all of the program reductions necessary to do so, we'll spend March frequently going through how we're going to make cuts to make the number that we've submitted to the town work. Sometimes we've done it ahead of time. Sometimes we've needed to take extra time to consider that in March. Other than that, that is the timeline of the process and what we'd like to spend. So we'll take questions on that, and then we'll spend a few minutes on what the framework of the budget looks like. So any questions on timeline?
And Pam, can I just pipe in quickly? December 2nd is the day I think we send out our package for the 7th at the Tuesday meeting. So
Bobby, you sound like
just
you're
wanna make sure.
underwater, unfortunately.
Okay.
I think he was trying to say that December 2nd, after our December 2nd meeting, we typically send out a copy of the budget to the towns after it's been approved at school committee.
So can we clarify? So December 2nd is a Thursday. So are we?
It's not
Yeah,
a Tuesday?
That's what I was trying to say. Sorry.
Okay.
Can you hear me any better now?
Okay.
Perfect.
Switch my Wi-Fi. Yeah, it's December 7th, and the 2nd is the day when we typically send the packets out. It's the Thursday before.
Ah, okay. I will redo this and have it back up.
And so we typically have to mail the tentative budget to the towns per the regional agreement, and they want 7 days before the tentative hearing. So that's why tentative hearing is on the Wednesday, 8 days later every year.
Okay, I will fix that. I think the other thing that Sarah noted, and we just want to bring up, is we go off schedule for January. So we typically meet on the 1st and the 3rd Tuesdays of the month, but January comes off schedule because of our need to make the budget timeline work, and the fact that nothing new really happens in budget world over the holiday break. So having a meeting of substance on that first Tuesday back from the break typically doesn't result in anything. So we'll go the 11th, skip a week, the 25th, and then back on track with the 1st. And if anybody else sees any other date inconsistencies, just let me know and we'll get those corrected. All right. So that is the timeline. Now let's talk about the more important issue, which is what's actually in the budget. So working off the presentation slides that we used with Essex, or the learning slides is probably a better phrase for them. We're going to take you through the top level. So in putting this together, we really tried to back up from what we know and try to put it in, answer some common questions that sometimes, because we work in such great detail and we've worked in such great detail for so long on the budget, we tend to assume people understand, and they don't. So just a couple of basics that we wanted to communicate to the Essex FinCom and Board of Selectmen, and it's good for this group to know as well, is that the MERC operational budget is managed to deliver stable and predictable spending and assessment growth rate from which apportionment is factored. So that's a big mouthful and a long way of saying that we try to hit a target number every year, so it is a consistent planning tool. We have not had big up and downs in our spending growth or our assessment growth year over year. We manage the key drivers and wildcards to maintain a target of 3.5%. So that's a generally agreed upon number that we did not come up with in a vacuum. This is a number, a spending growth number that there's a common understanding among that collaborative group that that is the target we're going to try and hit every year, so we don't break the town's model. What we're going to talk about as we go forward is how the spending number translates into an assessment number that translates into an apportionment number, and we'll define those things in a second. And it's when you get to the application of the formula that the towns come up higher or lower than the 3.5%, and that often causes some stress on the town side. So that was kind of the whole genesis behind why we had this presentation, was to try to better explain how the numbers shake out for the towns. And that's what this bullet refers to. It's the mechanics of apportionment that can inflate or deflate the apportionment growth, and then that causes the town's apportionment number to fluctuate, and it usually fluctuates in concert with the student enrollment. And then historically, the budget has been delivered as a level services budget, meaning we're not looking to expand program and staff unless we're looking at internal reorganizations to do so. So any new ad typically comes from something internally being reworked. So the key terms. Alvy, you want to take those?
Sure. So if you just think about the phrase you hear a lot about balanced budget, so you have your spending side and you need to be matched with an equal amount of revenue to pay for the spending. And often if you're, asking questions about, hey, how is spending going? Are we spending too much, too little? It's really important to start with that, because how we pay for it, which is the revenue side, comes second. So spending growth is just what did we buy? What do we pay for? And it's basically typically people, as well as, materials and contracted services. So that's a big number that I think a lot of people look to see, are we managing our finances well before it gets into who's paying for it and how. So the assessment, the equal amount of revenue, basically, because of the state aid formula with the Chapter 70 program, our two communities don't qualify for a whole lot of state aid. And when we show our revenue pie chart, typically non-town revenue is ballpark about 15%. And that's just because of the way the state formula works. So the remainder falls on the town, about, let's just say it's about 85%. That's called our assessment. It's the amount that the town pays. And every year we're really talking about these numbers in terms of growth rates, because growth rates are, the Proposition 2.5 constricts how much you can grow. And so making sure we don't trip an override, which we don't want to do, is all about managing these percentage increases, which is why you see the chart refer to that. So assessment is how much the towns pay to cover our spending, knowing that the state picks up a small portion. And then the regional agreement goes one step further, talking about assessment of which town pays how much and why. And that's all based on a formula. And that's called apportionment, how we apportion the assessment between the two towns. And sometimes you could have numbers on spending and assessment, as you'll see later, that might not be very exciting, kind of plain vanilla, as it were. But because of the apportionment formula, as Pam mentioned, it could create a little bit of an issue for one town or the other. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And just very briefly, the town, the regional agreement between the two towns splits the cost, where about 50% of the cost is based on student enrollment as it relates to the two towns. And the other two components are property values which is a proxy for ability to tax, as well as the number of people in each town, the population, which is just kind of gives a flavor to per capita costs. That's how it was envisioned, and it really hasn't changed a whole lot since regionalization, other than a couple of fine tunings. And there is a page in the budget workbook every year that we post online that shows the gory detail. And I'm happy to answer questions about that. We will get into that when we present the tentative budget, and it is always a topic of interest for the towns. So apportionment does become kind of important.
So quickly, any questions on the key terms? Because locking in on these makes the rest a little bit easier to understand. So now's a good time to ask. All right. So now we're going to try to define with a little greater depth each of these key terms and how they play out through our budget process. So spending. So what makes up the cost of running the school from year to year? This is just a diagram that shows what Avi was explaining, our revenue sources, the state funding versus the town assessment, and how we get money to run the district. And then this one gives you a little bit of a sense of how we build the budget. So you'll hear two budgets talked about: the operating budget, so the general cost of running the school, the personnel, the supplies, the materials, and then the capital budget, the debt service. The operating budget really starts with required spending. So the things that we have to spend money on either contractually or by statute, then gets into a level of preventative spending or common practices. So things like, for example, programmatically, required spending would be core curriculum. You have to have math, science, social studies, and English. You don't have to have art and music, or you do have to have PE. You don't have to have art and music. You don't have to have AP courses and high school electives. But those are common practices. If we didn't offer that battery of coursework, we would be putting our students at a disadvantage from every other community in the region, and I would say the Commonwealth. So those are other things that we spend money on that may not be legally required, but is just standard operating procedure and in the best interest of the competitiveness of our students. Then that's about it. That usually exhausts the majority of our budget. And as we said earlier, investments and program enhancements are typically handled through either grant funding, if we are lucky to have it, or by moving along something, a practice or a program that may be outdated or run its use, or could be restructured for inefficiency so we can create an investment. If you want to do the honors on a capital budget?
Sure. And the only thing I would just add to the preventative spending line, another example of that is things like preventative maintenance plans on our facilities. We don't have to do that. A lot of districts, when they have a budgetary problem, they just defer maintenance. But you know, the common knowledge is that what you don't do today will cost you more down the road. So that's an area where we're not required to spend on preventative maintenance, but it is kind of a way that we try to make good use of taxpayer dollars in the long run. Maybe not, you know, that's a short-term versus long-term type of trade-off. On the capital budget, all I just want to point out is that when the building projects at the middle school, high school, and Memorial School were passed, they were voted to have a debt exclusion. And debt exclusion is just a fancy way of saying that all that spending is excluded from Prop 2.5 limits. So we don't have to worry about the levy limit when it comes to debt service. We absolutely have to worry about it with the operating budget. So that's why we end up spending a lot more time. The other thing is that we structure the capital budget in general to decline every year. Just it's a mechanism we use to minimize interest expense over the life of the bond. It's another example of having multi-year look at how to be smart about taxpayer dollars. It's also known the numbers for the capital budget, they're fixed. We have debt schedules. There's no surprises, and that's good. The only surprises are when we issue new debt for a new project. So capital budget tends to be something no one tends to worry about. We will have to vote on it at the appropriate time.
So as we said up front, we have a history of stable and predictable spending and assessment growth. What we're showing here is the average annual increase in spending and assessment. You'll see we reference working in that 3.5% category, and our 5-year average puts us there. Our 10-year average is inclusive of the override, a year that we intentionally went over by agreement, joint agreement with the towns, and then our assessment at 3.6. It also notes the reductions we've made to close the annual gap. So keeping in mind our target of spending and assessment, we also make reductions in order to hit the mark of 3.5% and maintain level services. And this is just a sample of the of a 3-year look at reductions. And then our use of reserves. So this started to be a big part of our conversation last year. It will continue to be. When we can't hit the mark and we can't get there through reductions to close the gap, we'll have discussions about the proper use of reserve to help us make the 3.5 benchmark. And over the years, we're trying to signal that continued usage of that for the operational budget on non-one-time items may put us in a position to have a significant reduction in our reserves, which will then be detrimental to our borrowing for future projects like the Essex Elementary School. Avi, did you have any comment on this, or shall we move forward? Talk about key drivers. Did I lose Avi?
No, I was just giving a thumbs up. Yep, key drivers.
Go ahead.
Yep, we're, you can see here 65% of what we spend is on personnel. When you add in our next largest cost, which is health insurance, you're up to about 85%. So we are a people-driven organization in terms of where the money goes. And from a personnel standpoint, there's rates, how much you're paying people, and there's the number of people that you have, quantity and volume. And so we have very stable FTE, full-time equivalents. It means the number of full-time positions that we have in the district. So, and we track the rates, which is the part you see down below. The largest number of people we have are in our Teachers Association, Manchester-Essex Teachers Association. And, we pay for a cost of living increase, COLA, and you can see the numbers over the long term. And if you add in about 1.5 or step and column on top of the COLA, you can see those numbers 3.6 to 3.5, right in line with the spending numbers that Pam showed on the prior slide. So obviously with 65% of your spending coming from this area, it's going to drive the budget, but I think this shows that the numbers have been pretty consistent. There hasn't been a lot of shock there, and it really brings us in line with that those long-term spending patterns that you see. Here's the other 20% that we talked about, which is insurance. Again, when you're trying to hit a levy limit target of 3.5%, it's a little challenging to know that health insurance, which is 20% of your spending, grows ballpark 6 to 8% industry-wide, assuming that you are performing similarly to the market. So this is an important driver, and that's why we talk about it every year during budget cycle. We've made some changes over the years through negotiations. We had the Teachers Association work with us to make cost-saving measures that we could then put into the OPEB trust fund, which we'll talk about later, but it's basically retiree healthcare. So here's some of the changes that we've made over time. So it's one of those things where the market, in terms of what's being offered for common plans in other school districts, continues to change and evolve just because of the fact that 6 to 8% for all school districts can really break the budget. So over time, things continue to evolve, and we always take a look at what other districts are doing, and we use a commercial broker to help give us advice. We even get suggestions of what's happening in the corporate sector. This just at the bottom, I think, is useful for you to see when we talk about, compensation being not just salary, but also health insurance. You can see if the total cost for a family plan is currently about $28,000, our contribution of 75% for legacy hires or 70% for newer hires, it's about $20,000 per person. So it's a substantial investment, and it also has the potential to grow at rates that are beyond the levy limit. OPEB is a requirement of Mass General Law, which is that anyone who retires with eligibility for pension is mandated that we provide health insurance to retirees for life. And so we now are at a situation where the number of retirees that we cover are greater than the number of active employees. So it's a substantial cost area, and it's been growing about 12% per year. So when you hear the prior slide about 6 to 8%, this has been growing even faster. This is why a lot of taxpayers have rightly asked us for about a decade to be thinking about a long-term strategy for how to manage this cost so it doesn't turn into a taxpayer problem. And again, we had really great partnership with the Teachers Association to solve that challenge, which is why we now have $3.5 million in trust to shore us up for the time when we need to, those numbers become exceed what we can fund on an annual basis. And then you can just see some of the plans. The old plans, about $18,000 per head. That's the far right column in the top row. We've gradually moved to a situation where most people are on a Medicare supplement plan, and you can see the cost is much lower. That's where the retiree pays Medicare for their monthly premium, and we just pay a plan that sits on top per Mass General Law. And so we've saved a lot of money by having retirees move to Medicare as their primary plan. But these, for those who are interested in the details, we can talk about it more at another time. Suffice to say, retiree healthcare is at 12% annual growth is an area that can be challenging for levy limit management. And then the next biggest area that tends to grow in a way that can be a little bit, I guess I would say, somewhat unpredictably or somewhat beyond our ability to just manage it to, with full control, is out-of-district tuition and transportation for students who are placed in a placement that can't be served in the district. So it's mandated, and generally when we can't service kids in the district, we do, which is why we've developed several programs to serve them here. And there are tons of benefits for those in-district programs. In addition to kids being with their peers in their community schools, they're also very cost effective. And so net of all the staffing investments, we save, last time we looked about $1.5 million per year. So if we didn't have that in-district staffing, special ed staffing, which many districts don't, they just send kids out of district, our budget would go right up by about $1.5 million the next day. So it's very beneficial. And we know that some of these placements that we can't serve in district might be for needs that, for which maybe you can't get a whole cohort to serve a whole classroom of students. And those can be expensive, upwards of $100,000. And we have several of those in recent years. Okay, so we've talked about assessment.
I was just going to say, I'm
Yeah.
sorry, I was talking with you. That was kind of the big picture, big driver categories under spending. Any questions before we go into assessment? So that's how we come up with the annual operational number. And that number year over year gives us our spending growth number. Then we turn to that assessment component. So what piece of that spending gets passed on to the town?
Sorry, I was on mute. I'm not going to go through this slide, which is a big wall of numbers in detail, but what it basically talks about is how we try to look ahead on a multi-year basis. So we're not just looking at 1 year in a silo and thinking about sustainability. For example, let's say there's a new teacher's contract. One of the things we always look at is how does that play out over the life of the contract, as one example. But in other examples, if we're talking about use of reserves, which is highlighted in orange, as your spending grows and your revenue from, say, the state aid is very flat, about a 1.75%, you're going to be unless you increase what the towns provide through assessment, you're going to have to use more and more reserves every year. So that's why we don't like to do that. And it's recurring money from a one-time source. Revenues, the reserve funds don't replenish themselves. We have to, have certain pieces of good news happen and break our way to have them. So this just shows about how, reserve use, for example, in 1 year can have a multi-year impact. Okay, moving along to what we know is an issue. So this, slide 1 just shows that stable assessment level that we've been talking about, which is the bill to both towns combined before we split it up. It's a pretty tight range, and it's a range that is consistent with Prop 2.5. And as a reminder, Prop 2.5 allows for 2.5% growth plus growth on top of that for any new growth in property development. And so typically this tends to work. So if you go to the next slide, now you can see the same blue line in the middle, but layered on top is a red line for Manchester and a green line for Essex. And sometimes, in the early years, the red line was above the blue. So once we did apportionment and split the cost between the two towns, you could see Manchester paid a little bit more. And so at the bottom in the data, you can see fiscal 17 and 18, Manchester paid 45,000 more in fiscal 17, 68,000 more in fiscal 18. That's why the red line's above the blue. Whereas Essex in those same years paid the same exact amount less than the average would. If they were paying the same amount of the blue line and apportionment were neutral, there'd be no difference there. But fast forward a couple of years, and you can see that that's reversed, and we know that a portion of the stress that our budget last year was causing for the finance committee in Essex related to the fact that the apportionment for them was creeping up towards the 4% level, where it starts to be hard to fit within the levy limit. Our total blue line was still very much in line with our prior years, but because of the split, which relates to students enrollment and property values and number of people in each town, things that are out of really our control, it was pushing more funds towards Essex over time. At this 5-year look back or 6-year look back, Manchester still ended up paying a little bit more than the average, but we know that A, it's cyclical, it can change, and B, when you're the town who's above the blue line, it can be a little challenging because you're trying to fit all of our assessment and our apportionment to that town within their own levy limit. So it's something we have to be aware of and sensitive to. Even if we're doing great on the blue line, the green and red lines can have an impact as they did last year.
And this is where I usually just like to remind everybody of the analogy of going out to dinner and getting the bill and splitting the bill. It's the same amount, and no one is really being asked to spend more or less than they're using of the service. That's what really drives that apportionment line to be greater or less. So if you're owning a bigger piece of the apportionment bill at the end of the day, it's because your percentage usage of district services has increased. So it's not just a formula based on nothing, it's a formula based on usage.
So this is the same exact slide with the purple line added in, and what the purple line shows is what the blue line assessment would have been if we hadn't contributed reserves. The reserves, what they do is they provide revenue that's not the town providing revenue, and so it's essentially the district school committee and our reserve funds chipping in to cover the spending in a way that the town won't have to do. If we hadn't done that, you could see the total assessment, that purple line, prior to using reserves would be very high, close to 5%. We know that that's not a number that's sustainable. So that's part of the reason why we ended up chipping in those reserves, as much as we don't like to do that. It also shows that when we know that there's been some discussion in the towns through the collaborative process of, do the towns want to put some money aside on their own, knowing that some years they're going to be above the blue line, some years they're going to be below. And one of the questions was, well, if the towns are going to put some money aside to do that, should the district be chipping in as well? And so the reserve contribution, $770,000 just in the past 3 years, is exactly that. It's our contribution, and it's quite significant when you compare it to the amount over and above or below the blue line that the two towns are facing, which are more, on a 6-year basis, around 32,000. So we're definitely putting a lot of skin in the game, to use that phrase. We know it's not really sustainable, but it is a way that before we even go out to the towns and ask them to contribute anything in assessment, and before we think about apportionment, we're always thinking about, is the total assessment, the blue line, sustainable? Does it fit within our target range? So we try to take that step first, knowing that we can't just hand any number to the community. Now you could see the purple line and say, oh my God, up to 5%, you're using reserves because your spending's way out of control. And maybe if your spending weren't out of control, you wouldn't need to contribute the reserves. But if you look carefully, the orange line, which is new here, shows that the spending actually has been very tight and not really as big of a problem. Really what we have is a revenue problem where, because we know certain inputs like state aid, that other 15% is growing anywhere from 0 to 1.5%, it can't keep up. And so as a result, it puts more burden onto the towns and their assessment. So if you just look at the data and spending table where it says 2.81, 3.68, 2.9, you can see even with the use of reserves, fiscal 21, that purple line's way up there, but we only had spending growth of 2.84%. Okay, so again, we had to contribute the reserves because there isn't enough money coming from other sources, primarily state aid, which puts pressure on the towns, and we try to offset that with the reserves. Even in fiscal 22, where the number was 4.1, it's nowhere near that 5% that you see on the chart. So again, this is just a way to say, we think the spending is very much in line with a responsible budget. And if you're the town, in some years it's Manchester, and some years it's Essex, that is above that average, it can be very painful when you don't want to have an override, and we certainly don't want to cause one. But we shouldn't, from there, jump to the conclusion that spending is out of control, because you can see the spending numbers are really much pretty stable, and so and very much in line with the level services program. In particular, the last bullet's worth noting here. The last year, school committee said they really did not feel comfortable cutting spending any further to lower the assessment and apportionment, which is one of the reasons why we did contribute that money and why the assessment overall was 3.5% and why spending, you could see, ticked up a little bit at 4.11%. So there is a certain point where you do cuts year after year where you don't really have a lot more to cut without starting to impact the program. And so that was the decision by school committee through the budgeting process, where we decided to kind of, instead of just bring the numbers down even further to a number that sounds a little better, try to preserve the program and offset it somewhat with reserves and somewhat with a higher assessment rate.
So that's the basic gist of thing. Questions? Oh, this is probably worth a quick highlight. Capital, our anticipated capital needs. This plays, this is the projected use of reserves in the go forward years in terms of investing in keeping our buildings up. You'll see that Essex increasingly is going to need investment, which will tie to our longer term conversation in our upcoming walkthrough to establish a timeline for Essex elementary building project.
Yeah, and this chart's from a prior presentation. You've seen we've started to take off some of these things through reserves like the Eagle's Nest, as well as the capital, the technology enhancement that we did for Essex Elementary. But turf fields is going to be certainly a big one that we're going to be talking about, and knowing that we may want to make sure we get at least one of the turf fields accomplished this coming summer, we are going to start to talk through a process of how we do that and making sure we, have probably, I would imagine, be on the facility subcommittee to start to work through that, as well as continuing to prioritize these needs. This is where the reserve should be going for one-time uses.
And just a very quick look, and then we probably should go to questions and discussions given the time. This slide just gives you, and it's in your deck in a larger format, it will give you a sense of what some of the measures we've used to cut gaps in the past have been. I think the one thing I'd point out for your attention is you'll see lots of small little things. You'll see a tuition prepay mechanism, the hiring cap, which can fluctuate over time. But typically, when we are able to make any significant gains in cutting to make up the difference in cutting to bring our spending down to 3.5%, it comes through attrition of staff. So attrition of staff simply means that there is staff retiring or resigning, and we're not replacing those positions. So it's similar to a hiring freeze. We haven't really been forced yet to have to cut somebody's position who is in service. So they tend to be quiet and not noticed as much as if someone is unfortunately laid off from a job. We have not played around with, but had to reduce some fractional FTE and share people between buildings as a way of achieving some efficiencies. Those savings are shown here through attrition because those came as a result of a retirement. It's the last thing we'll go over, and then hopefully you have some questions, is if you look at the faculty distribution over the time, one question we get typically is, if enrollment has come down, why hasn't staffing come down? And the reality is enrollment fluctuations in staffing are most closely tied at the general classroom or subject area level. So if you think about your math classroom, your art classroom, your general elementary classroom, that general ed staffing number has fluctuated over time and come down. It's also, and we're working on a separate chart for this, it's also moved. So we've lost positions at the elementary, but they've had to be moved to the high school because we still have a bit of the bubble there. So we are seeing classroom subject area teachers track and move throughout the district based on where the enrollment is. But the most direct growth area in terms of staffing, the one that makes it look like our staffing number doesn't really go anywhere, is we've had a significant increase in special education and support services staff over the years. And this has been by design and direct investment in in-district programming as a means of, first and foremost, serving students who deserve to be in district here in district by developing cohort programs, but also providing an opportunity to keep students in district who may otherwise opt to go out of district or petition to go out of district. So that is something that we are going to do a little bit of a deeper study on in preparation for the budget. But that's our budget story, and those are the key pieces that go into it and the key terms necessary for understanding it. I'm curious what questions you might have.
Well, I have questions, but I was waiting to see if anybody else does because I ask all the questions. Do you want general questions because you're teaching us about this process right now, or do you want specific questions looking forward?
I'm good with either.
That's a question for Sarah. Okay. Having heard the explanation a couple of times, but I think it'd be helpful for me and probably for all of us. Avi, could you speak to the snowball effect of reserve use so that we can just really clearly wrap our heads around that?
Sure. I mean, if you go first to the multi-year budget slide, which I tried to spare you all the gory detail of it because it's so many numbers, but I'm going to summarize it very quickly. The spending numbers are at the top: personnel and other operating expenses. And let's just say those numbers that say are 4.2% before you do, just for level services, okay? If you look at the number 2 area of revenue being state aid, and you see how that's growing 1.75% here, right off the bat, you know state aid is not keeping up with spending. If we were to try to grow spending at 1.75%, we'd be cutting our budget significantly. So something else has to make up for that difference. And trying to avoid having an accelerating amount of spending hitting the assessment means we need to come up with that revenue someplace else. So that's why in this model, you can see if we try to just hit 3.5% in the yellow consistently, given the spending that I just showed you and given the state aid that we talked about, the gap would have to be filled by the reserves, and that's why that increases. It's increasing to cover level services spending that we can't cover through state aid, and we don't want to push overly onto the towns to trip an overhead. I hope that is a short answer.
Actually, it's a good lead into what I was trying to ask, and I probably didn't do it succinctly enough. But first, a really, really silly thing to say, just for all of us newbies looking at this, that these are in thousands, these lines here. These are $335,000, friends, each year in fiscal year 21 and 22. I know that's pretty obvious, but since other things are in thousands. But just the idea, again, that we put in 100,000 in fiscal year 20, that's, like you said, not a one-time use thing. We have to still make that up the next year, plus whatever else we need. And then the following, we're still paying for those plus whatever else we need. And that's why this is just growing at such a rate. I'm getting that right.
Yes. No,
Okay.
you
Yes.
100%.
Yes.
And unlike everything else, the reserves are not recurring revenue. It's one-time money. There's a finite amount of it, and you can spend them all, which we obviously don't want to do. And we're not about to do that. But if we don't have an exit strategy for how we're going to get out of that, you would. And so that's where the other slide that I know Pam was going to bring up shows that on a very quick basis, 2 to 3 years, you could really, and again, this is just to show how it works. You could see it includes 21, 22, 23. We'll fast forward this to a future, look, but the concept is basically, you could spend 335 on operations in that top line, but then that recurs in future years, even if you don't increase. Right off the bat, you're at, whatever, $900,000 there. But then there are other things that we need to do. There's COVID that we know we're going to pick up a piece of. We did the Essex technology that is already done. We did the Essex playground. We had an emergency item with the memorial boiler, which we were able to salvage some of that and move it to the Essex school. And we know that there's a backup boiler. We got 2 turf fields. So you can see that those are the things, as Pam showed on that $1.8 million facilities capital chart, where you want to be spending your money, because you're not going to be buying a boiler, every single year. You don't really want to be spending it on paying for your recurring costs that you are going to be spending every year. It's just not good coming. And that's what the credit rating agencies tell you, the exact same thing.
Thank you. And then my one other question, and this might be too specific for tonight, and that's okay if you just table it. But in a general sense, when we're talking about some of the restructuring to bridge that gap, and as the example of people that might retire, and you choose to restructure rather than replace that position. But for the the teachers and staff who do retire, and we do end up replacing that position, and they're coming in at a lower rate or step or what have you with those things, does that end up being a wash based on the retirement packages? How does that impact?
Well, I'm trying to find the slide where we ballpark savings at replacing an M15 with an M5 at about $65,000. So what we know in any given year, our ability to do that depends on the type of teacher retirement we're experiencing. So if you're needing to replace, I always use physics as the example. If you need to replace an AP physics teacher at the high school, you are not likely going to find an M5 replacement for that. So you're not really going to get the savings. So we try to hit the target and we ballpark it, but we always try to make sure we're not hitting this target at the expense of quality in the classroom. So I think it's fluid is the best way to put it.
Got it. Thank you. That helps.
Yeah. Other thoughts or questions?
I don't have thoughts and questions because I went to this presentation the other night, and so I've been through it. But I wonder if any of the new people have thoughts and questions. Maybe it's a lot to take in and absorb. So maybe people don't. I don't know.
I'll go to this slide too, not to focus on the faculty piece, but I think what this shows you too is that concept of the required spending versus some of the discretionary spending. So a lot of the special ed spending is in that required bucket. So I think when you're looking at how Avi explained in the multi-year budget, the things that are required spending just automatically grow faster and with less internal controls than the discretionary spending. So I think that's because I think it's logical to ask the question, well, why are we always needing a multi-year catch up because spending outstrips the growth of revenue? And it's just because the levers we have to control in the drivers aren't the ones that yield the greatest results.
I guess the one budget kind of letter that I got in my inbox this week was from the Performing Arts Group, which is a great group that's done some fundraising and organizing around increasing performing arts in our communities. And they had some items on their wish list, like a drama,
Fine arts coordinator.
Yes, fine arts coordinator, and some other things. And I know that the principals sometimes have wish lists. So I think this is, it's a good presentation because it helps people understand why we can't just say, oh yeah, we definitely want a fine arts coordinator. We'll just tack that on the top. Like that goes into that little piece on the top of the triangle. That's like an extra thing that we'd love to have, but we can't necessarily afford it because this is the situation that we're facing every year. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Thank you so much for putting all that together. Some of those new slides I think are really helpful, or else I've watched it 8 times now. So I finally am starting to understand some of the vocabulary.
Well, hopefully it wasn't too boring for those who had to sit through it for a second time. I think it's taken me, I finally have the aha moment that we use those 3 terms interchangeably. And unless you really stop long enough and have somebody explain to you how they are variations on a theme, you can kind of get lost. And I think it's to our detriment because the spending number is a good story, but everyone typically focuses on the apportionment number, which isn't reflective of anything we do or control. It's a function of a predetermined formula and who's using the service.
Right. Right. Well, it's a great presentation. And so I think it should be a great budget season. And I know we don't have that many people on the call tonight, but I did put out a call to the Essex PTO, and maybe we can just continue to share that budget calendar so that people know when the public hearings are and they can really come and have a little bit more of a question and answer and opportunity to comment. It'll be great.
And we'll get that article out on the blog and on an email and out to the Cricket, just kind of reminding people of the calendar, the process, and
yes, with the correct dates.
With the correct date, I made my little notation.
Yeah, and just that reminder that we're on a different schedule in January. I think that's, or in December, in January.
January.
January is the off month. All right. Is there any school committee comment in general before we wrap up tonight? Nothing?
Nothing.
All right. Well, thanks for entertaining all of our thoughts and ideas tonight, as always. And I guess we'll see everybody. Oh, it's Thanksgiving, right? So we won't. Happy Thanksgiving, safe travels, enjoy your time with your families. Come to the football game if you're around. And I guess that's it. Do we have a motion to adjourn?
So moved. Burke.
Is there a second?
Second. That's usually Ken's job to to do the motion.
Oh, Ken's traveling tonight, so he wasn't able to be here. All right. So, Eric, are you a yes?
Yes.
Matt?
Yes.
Kate?
Yeah.
Chris?
Yes.
Teresa?
Yes.
I'm a yes. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you to all the people who joined our meeting, and we'll see you back in 2 weeks. Or
Good
so,
night.
3 weeks. 3 weeks. Okay, good night.
Good night. Thank you.